What's up, everybody? Billtendo back here, hopefully for the very last time, talking about the Game Junction. So, this video has specific intentions, whereas things have progressed where they are. This intention is to basically wrap what we've seen, what we know, and address certain issues. Um, Not only with the subject at hand, but relating to the subject when it comes to myself, certain things were left out, and I'm going to explain why. And hopefully, it makes sense to everyone. So, first thing I want to talk about is what interviews were included. Now, as everybody knows, months and months ago, I started recording all of these videos. I interviewed over 10 people that I have recorded interviews for, former members of Game Junction. So at the time, no one really wanted to put their name out there. No one wanted to be the one to get the ball rolling. And with the situation, that's highly understandable. No one wanted to be out first just in case no one believed them and it went poorly. And so for months, I sat on this information. And I sat on this information for several different reasons. One of them was the fact that people were hesitant and reticent to get out front and say, this happened to me, whether they feared retribution or embarrassment, or they had any other feelings about it. They didn't want to be out there. And I understand that. When you're taken advantage of, when you're manipulated, it causes certain feelings in yourself. Another reason it took so long and they didn't get released is after all the interviews, I generally tend to be a very community minded person. I have a high tolerance for everyone. I understand everyone in the world's situation is different. And after recording all of these interviews, I myself was feeling a certain type of way. I mostly the consistent negativity of how things progressed and the stories and the consistent nature of the stories made me feel kind of gross. And I've told my friends this, and for a while I didn't want to touch it. And it got to the point where I didn't want to make any content at all because I'm not a journalist. I'm not here to write stories and write articles. That's not my thing. And so doing something that felt journalistic, I don't understand how journalists deal with such a negative story. I don't know how people write about bad things that happen to people because maybe I feel too much. I'm a little too empathetic, and I feel people's situations, and it bothers me, and I feel certain ways. And so that also held back. Now, I have been speaking to the people that I interviewed over the last few months. And, consistently, when you're ready to step out and say, this is me, we're going to get the ball rolling. But I wasn't too heavy on it. And more and more people were coming to me, so I started doing more interviews. And again, it's the same old. So let's move forward. I wasn't feeling good about the way it made me feel to see the way these people were affected, and no one wanted to jump out front. But eventually, shout out to N Squared Podcast, who is also friends with Brandy, the gamer aimer, who is a very integral part of this story. They said her name. Now, Brandy's been on my podcast before, and we briefly touched on the subject, but we had spoke beforehand that we would not name the Game Junction. We would not name the Discord server or anything like that. So if you watch my podcast, you understand that these things have come up before and they've been out there, but we were not naming. So I want to give credit to Brandy because the fact that she is such a nice person, both on screen and off screen, and the fact that she is genuine and trustworthy, and that her story gives credence to all these other stories. Even though she's commented on all the videos, she hasn't felt the need to tell her story, and I appreciate that. And the reason that she didn't feel the need to appreciate that is my first point on this wrap-up video, and that is the timeline of events. So Brandy's story intersects with Thomas's story, intersects with Dr. Scott's story, and intersects with Craig's story. And that's why these specific stories were chosen to demonstrate the timeline. And since all of these people had their own stories, which also included aspects of Brandy's story, she didn't feel the need to tell her story herself. And if she ever does, we're here and we're ready to listen. You have a very supportive community. However, she may not feel that's necessary, and that's understandable. Now, that gets us into the subject of what was left out and why. So when our timeline starts with Dr. Scott at the beginning of the Game Junction podcast. Excuse me. But the story actually begins before that. If you saw the original video in this series, video 1, where I originally called out Game Junction, you'll know that there was another situation before the podcast, and that was the whatnot situation. Now, why didn't we address the whatnot situation in this series of interviews? Well, it's quite simply the person that was involved with Game Junction at the time, that was the recipient of this poor behavior. I have spoken to him at great length. We have recorded interviews. However, he would not like his identity revealed in this instance to the public for the simple fact that he works with certain organizations and certain organizations within the gaming space. And he does not wish to tarnish the associations that he works with any kind of connection to Game Junction. He wants to keep those things separate. And for this reason, I'm respecting his privacy. I'm not going to put his name out there, and we're not going to tell his entire story. I went over the highlights of the whatnot situation and the formation of the Game Junction pre-podcast, and that was his story. But that's as far as his story is going to go for now, because he would like to keep his name private, because he doesn't want the extremely positive organizations that he works with in the gaming space to have any negative association with Game Junction. And I respect that. So that's why that was left out of the story. Also, we covered why Brandy's specific interview was left out of the story, was left out of the series, to respect her privacy. Also, you should know, she never, it's so hard for her to say a bad word about anyone, that to do an entire interview where she explains all of this bad stuff would be extremely difficult and taxing on her emotionally. And so for that reason, she's chosen to stay as is and not speak on it in an interview for a while. And so that was left out. So we have the beginning left out, and we have Brandy's specific story left out. However, everyone in the story has intersected with Brandy. Whether it's Dr. Scott from the very beginning of the Game Junction podcast and his story, all the way up to when he left, when he worked with Brandy, and then Thomas and Brandy starting about the same time and leaving at the same time, which caused Craig to be recruited by the Game Junction, in which he left in a very, very fast manner. So I feel like we've established a very firm timeline, and I find everyone's interviews very credible. I would also like to say that before each interview, there were ground rules. Thomas, I had never spoken to before. Thomas reached out to me after the first video, so I did not know any of Thomas's story except what I had heard from others. That's Millennial Collector Ohio. or Thomas is the intern, as I call him, because that sounds to me. Anyway, great guy. But his story, I had not heard from him. I had not spoken to him before. Now, the ground rules for the stories were fairly simple. And the ground rules were A, we're not we're going to try not to name any specific conventions. They're to be referred to as a convention or the convention. Although that didn't always work out, basically because we didn't want any kind of negative association. Second ground rule was consistently you can tell a part of the story that concerns Gamer Aimer in your perspective, but we are not going to tell her story. She can tell it herself if she's ever ready. So, the third ground rule was basically we are not going to bash him for bash Brandon for things that are unnecessary. Everyone was super in agreement on that. But sometimes you just have to say it because you don't know which direction an interview is going to go, as none of the interviews were scripted. They were also not really discussed beforehand as far as exactly what we're going to say. I had talked to Dr. Scott in the past, I had talked to Craig in the past, and I knew the basic outline of their story, but to the extent just now that we all saw, I was unaware of a lot of those factors, just as you were. So, at the end of the day, I think we're all hoping to see better behavior. I think we're all hoping to see Brandon apologize. And the Game Junction moving forward would be a part of the community instead of just taking from it. Now, I've also been warned in advance. As soon as I started doing interviews, I was told that there would be doctored messages of mine released. And, this, Brandon, if you're watching this, specifically, very, very specifically to you and to you only, I want to say, if you are angry at anyone, if you're angry at anyone at all in this situation and you feel the need to get back at someone, someone to vent at, someone to rage at, please let that be me. You have all the reason in the world to rage at me. I tattled on you. At one time, I considered you a friend. I have struggled with this deeply, how in the process of someone at one time I called a friend, that I had to be one of the ones to speak out, to be a place to let people speak out. So if you want to be angry at anyone and you want to find some kind of retribution with anyone, please let it be me. Okay, so that being that, I don't want to run this forever. I'm planning right now on this being it. I have spoke to some people and they may want to tell their story, and I will gladly speak with them because some people need to tell their story for closure for themselves, and I'll be here for the people for that. But for the most part, I think it's up to Brandon to see what's going to happen next. As of right now, 99% of social media has been business as usual for Game Junction. They've ignored everything with the exception of a short live video from a convention this weekend where he made the comment, I will address issues in the community soon. So I think at this point, we all wait. Brandon, show us that you're going to do better. Everybody, if you have any questions, my inbox is always open. I'll talk to anybody. I want to thank Dr. Scott. I want to thank Brandy, the Gamer Aimer. I want to thank Thomas, the Millennial Collector, Ohio. I want to thank N Squared, phenomenal, everybody. And all the people that were affected. I do appreciate your time. All right. Y'all have a good day.